Absolutely. Oh man, before I jump off, thank you so much, Kiram and VRTO. Thank you so much, Miriam and David from Trinity Square Video. It's been really amazing to see this whole festival and get to hang with Claudia and Alex last week as well. So yeah, thank you all for being here and making this happen. I guess tonight what I'd like to do is maybe talk a bit about some of my own practice, how I came to virtual reality, as well as hubs and this whole kind of metaverse idea, and maybe point towards a few directions. But before we jump in proper, I just wanted to check, can everyone hear me okay? I don't sound too much like a robot, despite looking like one?
You don't sound like a robot. You sound good. The closer you get to your mic, the better, but you're smooth bandwidth-wise.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you guys. Let's jump in. Hey, my name is Matthew Gantt. Here's a picture of me looking intently at a laptop to kind of contextualize this. I do a lot of work with experimental sound, composition, music, more recently virtual reality. For the last 10 years, I've been based in New York City, in Brooklyn, and then Queens. I've been fairly active as a performer, as a composer, and recording artist, presenting work at DIY venues across the USA, as well as sort of more institutional spaces. This is a concert at the Glove in Brooklyn, and to the right at Secret Project Robot. I also record for a few different labels. I record predominantly for Oxtail, based between New York City and Sydney, Gold Bolus in Brooklyn, and Orange Milk, based between Ohio and New York City. I also, in tandem with this, do a lot of installation work with spatial sound, with, up until recently, with Vive, Unity, sort of standard game engine VR, but more recently that's been changing. What I'd like to do with this talk is maybe connect some of the concerns of these disparate practices and sort of see how I see them as sort of a connected path, and where I think those might be going in a broader context. In parallel with all this work, I also operate as a community organizer through a nonprofit in Lower Manhattan called HarvestWorks, which has a long history as a public access media space. In 2017, we worked to create a public access virtual reality studio. As I think a lot of us know, even with the decreasing cost of a lot of this equipment, it's still prohibitively expensive, and that really limits the amount of voices and the conceptions that come into the space. So that whole kind of question of the equitable technology with what types of visions are being created has really underscored a lot of this. Here's back at HarvestWorks, actually, with composer Gloria Spiegel, back when we got our first Oculus DK2 in the good old days. More recently, at the beginning of last year, I actually just moved upstate to Troy, New York, to start a doctorate program at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is home of a space called MPAC, which is sort of modeled after a space like Ear Common Parish and the Stanford Karma Lab, so kind of a research and artistic space focused on spatial sound, virtual reality, and experimental composition. But maybe it'd be worth unpacking all of that. So what I'd like to do is maybe give a few conceptual origin stories about how I got into all this, and maybe how this all relates. So before I was working with media art, way back in the day, I went to music school. I played guitar, bass, drums, piano, etc. Here's an embarrassing picture of me as a young human playing bass guitar, and oftentimes I'm involved in a lot of kind of improvisational music, a lot of jazz, a lot of rock and roll, things kind of a little more experimental in between. But the salient thing is that the way I related to a lot of this practice was very much an embodied one. The idea you play the instrument, there's an audience, there's sweat, there's lights, there's sound, but it's very present, it's very real time, it's very embodied. And I think in the kind of conventional wisdom, we've got kind of a picture of this caricature of of the catharsis of performance. But as I started to grow musically, I started working a lot more with electronic music, with synthesizers, with samplers, with algorithmic music, with generative structures, sound installation, etc. And while this felt very aesthetically satisfying to me and very conceptually satisfying, it felt like there was a bit of a disjunct for me coming from this background in an embodied practice, trying to sort of reconcile what the relationship between the audience, the performer, the physicality of the space, and the sound itself was. And it felt like there was a disjunct. And I think there's a bit of received kind of cultural wisdom around that as well. If anyone's familiar with Auditor, this is Rob Brown, who's a amazing electronic composer and a just hideously boring performer. If anyone's ever seen the what kind of noise musician joke or meme, or the one, I don't know if you can see it, but the one at the outset on the right says, he's saying, "I wonder if anyone can tell I'm just on Facebook." So this model, right? This model of the electronic performer just being this disembodied sort of meat sack in front of the laptop. It felt like there was this disjunct for me trying to relate to these things. And it was something that really gave me pause as I was growing as a creative individual. And so what I want to do to kind of bridge from here into some of the work I'm doing nowadays is to share two kind of like open sesame moments for me that really helped me kind of bridge the gap conceptually. In the first, in 2015, I was given a research grant to go to IRCAM in Paris, which is a kind of a historical Center for Electronic Music, for Computer Music, for Avant Sound Research. And while I was there, a good friend of mine, a collaborator named Lindsay Drury, she's a choreographer, now based out in Berlin. We met up for a drink before while we were there. And, we've been doing a lot of talking about this question of embodiment as it relates to media. And we decided we were going to meet up and go to an organ concert in Notre Dame, while we were there. So we went to the concert, and the strangest thing happened to us. It was a beautiful show. The music was very beautiful. The space, obviously, was incredible. But the strangest thing when we left, we left the concert, and we looked at each other and we said, "Hey, you know what? That was a laptop performance. That was the most disembodied performance I've ever seen." And it was this moment of refiguring of this question of this question of performer to an instrument, to an audience, to a physical space, to media, to this kind of folding of architecture to installation, to media, to composition. This way in which composition can be more about the totality of it. And that gave me a seed that kind of connected with a lot of other things. I imagine some of us are familiar with Lucier Verez Xenakis Phillips Pavilion at the World Fair, which was site of the installation of Home Electronique, early avant-garde piece. Or say someone like Stockhausen at the Osaka World Fair with this spatial sound dome. And it really started getting me thinking about less about the relationship of the physical body to an instrument and more about the physical body to space and sort of the embodiment of the media itself and the way we can sort of expand our notion of these things. The other sort of related thing that really got me thinking from this line and sort of bridged the gap into VR. In 2016, I was very, very fortunate after I left graduate school to meet the electronic composer Morten Subotnick. And some of you might be familiar with his work. If not, if you've ever seen an analog synthesizer, a Buchla synthesizer, any of these kind of crazy sci-fi looking instruments, he was one of the originators with Donald Buchla in the 60s. So he's just this absolute huge figure of electronic music who, I think in a similar way, lived at this moment, this inflection point of sort of refiguring his relationship to technology. In addition to his compositional practice, he was close friends with the media theorist Marshall McLuhan. If anyone's ever heard the term, or the one-liner, "the medium is the message," that was him. The other one, which really stuck with me, this is another Marshall McLuhanism, is he says that we look at the present through a rear-view mirror, and we march backwards into the future. And what he means by that, generally, is that when we're confronted with something new, we generally use the metaphors of the old to make sense of it. So the car isn't something new. The car is a horseless carriage, right? The synthesizer isn't new. It's an electric organ. And Marshall McLuhan and Morten Subotnick, they really pushed back against that, against that idea of like, well, if we have something new, let's find what's genuinely new about it. What are the new affordances? How can we, how can we look forwards? And that stuck with me. And where this really connected up, in 2016, I was brought out to Moogfest in North Carolina with Morten Subotnick. And this was right, when the Vive and the Oculus, things were starting to hit. And Moogfest is kind of a, music and an arts and technology festival. So there's a lot of people kind of showing these things. And one of the little pavilions there was by Netflix. And it was, simultaneously, it was the worst virtual experience I've ever seen. And counterintuitively, it was actually one of the most inspiring. And what it was It was for Samsung Gear VR, if I remember correctly. But you went in, and you went into this kind of virtual reality cabin, and you could look around, you could see the virtual couch, you could see the virtual snow out the window. But the idea is you would then sit in this beautiful 3D environment, and then you would sit down and look at a 2D screen. So completely doing something amazing and forcing, and then completely missing all of the opportunities of it. And it was almost just so banal and so bad that it was kind of this light bulb moment of saying, like, all right, well, who really has agency in the space? Who's imagining what the future could look like? And who has kind of power here? What's possible? In that kind of critical line of questioning, connecting with this history of electronic composition, of spatial sound, etc., really started getting me into, it felt like this open sesame into the space. So I ended up teaching myself Unity around 2016, and my background, I went to conservatory, I studied music theory. I was not a coder, I was not really a technology person. So I found myself very, very much as an outsider in the space, and I really just chain smoked a lot of cigarettes, watched a lot of YouTube tutorials, and sort of brute forced my way through it. But the thing I started finding as I was learning, was that, as with any technology, this technology was not culturally neutral. It was not value neutral. Even though ostensibly you can build anything with Unity, there's an implicit path that you were guided on. And as an example of that, when I first started learning how to make menus, this is a screenshot of a tutorial from Unity. The way you practice clicking on something is you shoot it with a gun. So already, I've used Unity for maybe 2 hours, don't know what on earth I'm doing, but I can already shoot a gun. So there's this kind of implicit path, and that manifests all sorts of places. And there's a long history of artists investigating that. And so what I found myself doing was trying to reconcile this history of experimental music. This is my studio at the time, trying to patch this one methodology into an emerging technology that was really not kind of thinking of it. So the first piece I made for virtual reality with a borrowed HTC Vive. I couldn't afford one at the time, so I actually got a job at a VR arcade in New York City, so I could use their equipment after hours. The first piece I put together was called 5 Ton Ephemeral, and this is a screenshot of it. And the way this came together, did not really have any chops with 3D modeling. I didn't really have a lot of agency in the space. So I started going on these different libraries, these different models, and just sort of sourcing things. So I ended up doing a bit of an experiment. If anyone's ever heard the joke about how banal the catchphrase, the intersection of art and technology is, I use that as a jump-off. So what I started doing was I'd go on these object libraries, and I would just search keyword art, keyword technology. And whatever was free, I would download that, and that's what would go into the piece. And I took this corpus of material, and as you see, you get a lot of military equipment, you get a lot of caricatures of outdated fetishized technology, and made this sort of media assemblage, this kind of like Rauschenberg-esque assemblage that you could explore. And what I ended up doing was creating this environment and then finding ways to actually use MIDI and OSC and different processes from my music practice to animate the space. So say I could use an LFO or an envelope or various kind of compositional techniques and use that to animate the space and create this sort of kinetic sound sculpture. And that piece went on to, was installed at Pioneer Works in Red Hook in Brooklyn. We showed it at NYU. We showed it at a gallery show at Outpost Artist Resources in Queens, New York, and a few other spots around town. In parallel with that, we still had a lot of interest both in this question of the body and embodiment in relationship to media, and then also who was really deciding these things, who had agency in the space, who was driving the conversation forwards, and what kind of market forces were really dictating this to be about. So another thing that caught our eye around the same time was IKEA had actually put out this IKEA VR shopping experience, and you could go into a VR kitchen and you could try out VR furniture to your heart's content, potentially buy it. So around the same time, Lindsay, the choreographer that I was talking about that we went to Notre Dame with, she gave me a call and we started saying, what if we use this as a site for dance? What are the choreography of shopping in virtual reality? What if we did a site-specific experience to online shopping? What would this look like as a dance piece? So we did a little bit of fundraising. We wrote, IKEA, we wrote Google, we wrote a few media art spaces in New York City, and they turned us all down, unsurprisingly. But we were fortunate. Actually, a friend of ours had a space in Portland, Oregon, so we were able to kind of scrape our pennies together. And we went and we flew out, maxed out some credit cards, and we were able to rent a Vive, and actually they had just gotten a grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation and purchased a perception neuron motion tracking suit. So what we did, actually, we did a week of movement research in Portland where Lindsay and Gabriel is a friend and another dancer. They would go in and they would shop for furniture, and we would motion track them. And we sort of treated this as a movement vocabulary building exercise, where we built up this library of, what are the aesthetics of disembodied shopping? What remains in the physical world? And that ended up with us building this kind of corpus, this library of banal movement, and then also a bit of extraneous media. You see them here composited in front of a green screen. Sadly, still none of these corporations, unsurprisingly, no one wanted to touch this, so the project kind of stayed where it was. But we were very fortunate. The next year, Lindsay and I were accepted for an artist in residency program at Pioneer Works, again, Red Hook, Brooklyn, where we were brought on not to necessarily develop that project, but to take this concept and expand it. And what we were able to do then was build on this and develop an evening-length work for audience, where it was a virtual reality piece, but it wasn't for the audience to see it, but rather it was a way of almost doing like sort of a situationist, a tournament, of sort of reframing the question of disembodiment as an aestheticized, embodied action. So what we did when we were looking for framing, we got really into, as sort of a historical precedent, we got very into this piece by Maya Deren from 1945 called A Study in Choreography for Camera. And I imagine some of you might have seen this one. But there's this question where she treats actually the video camera, an early camera, as a choreographic body unto itself, as well as an object of gaze, and where these power structures stand with regards to creating media, consuming media, as well as the technology, the technological object as a body unto itself. And as we were developing this, we took a lot of these movement structures. We were able to map these onto avatars, where Lindsay would actually both be a physical presence on stage, dancing both with her avatar self, doing an embodied and disembodied duet, as well as we were able to project the feed from what she was seeing. And as such, she actually became a choreographic camera. Actually, case in point, not unlike Kiram is very valiantly operating as a cambot, as an embodied camera. So there's this type of nested embodiment and gaze inside of this. Also, with the help of Pioneer Works, we were able to develop this piece. We were also able to develop a back end where we were able to combine a Unity session file with Ableton, with Max MSP, with a lot of my sonic work, and find ways to actually send signals where Lindsay's movement was controlling sounds and vice versa. And in the space, we had a 4-channel, multi-channel speaker array around the audience. So actually, as sounds happened, we could tie those to various virtual objects, which would be localized around the audience in relationship to the audience, in relationship to the dancer, in relationship to the virtual object. And we could also do various things where choreography would control a strobe light, would control projections, etc., etc. Let's see, I don't want to bore anyone to your tears here, so we'll pivot into hubs in a little bit. But maybe connecting these two. This question of where the audience is and where the performer is really kind of came to haunt us in a way. I think we got really infatuated with sort of where this was localized, where who was a performer, who was an audience, who was consuming versus who was producing. So after that residency, I was very fortunate to be brought in as an artist in residence at SVA in Chelsea in Manhattan. And I was asked to do an installation version of this piece, where rather than having a dancer in VR, we would transfer the virtual experience back onto the audience. So what we ended up doing was I took a lot of the choreography that was developed during that piece and built it as a duet, for two audience members that could come in as an installation. They would both wear HTC Vives. They would enter a new space. We actually took a lot of that motion capture and created a duet dance, along with various kind of vocal prompts that would prompt the audience to explore the space. But the thing is, unbeknownst to the audience members in VR, this environment, these prompts, were actually causing them to do a physical dance in synchronization with each other without them seeing each other. So it became this bait and switch where the audience kind of came in to try and sort of see the shiny toy, to wait in line to ride the roller coaster, to see the virtual experience. And in a way, they actually became the performers for the other people still in line. So it became sort of this total, we'd like to think maybe this total experience where it's operating on multiple nested levels simultaneously. As this all was going on, this still has kind of informed a lot of my musical practice. I recently put out an album with Orange Milk and have been performing pre-COVID, was doing a lot of concert experiences where going back to this idea of the electronic performer as sort of a disembodied presence, I was really getting into this idea of pretty much our contemporary experience. We live in real life, but we're also always plugged into Facebook, plugged into social media, into Instagram, what have you. So we're already sort of conceptually cued into layering a virtual environment over the physical one. So I started doing a lot of performances where I had a second performer navigating a virtual space as I would perform the electronic music, and these two things would relate to each other. What I'd like to do, if I may, is I'm going to try and embed a Vimeo link real quick. So hopefully I don't screw this up too bad. But I'd love to show you all just a quick snippet of it. And while I'm setting up, just to check in, can everyone still hear me okay? I don't sound like a robot or anything?
Sound great.
Love it. Cool. All right, so I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of clunkily try and embed a video for us to watch. And let's see if we can get it. Boop, 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 boop. Boom. Boom. And so this is from from a performance earlier this year at Outpost Artist Resources in Queens. And you see a lot of these environments make a comeback, and you see a lot of relationship between the backdrop, the virtual visuals, and the sounds. And I'm just going to play about 2 minutes of this. Oop. And I'm actually going to fast forward just a hair to get us right into it. Stop it there for now. But this whole thing is up on YouTube or on Vimeo if it's of interest to anyone. I can certainly post a link later. And also, something maybe we can talk about of interest, maybe why these objects, why these environments, how these things kind of come and accumulate. But generally, this idea of finding a unification, not necessarily of an audio-visual art where the sound happens, then some sound effect or some visual effect happens, but rather some sort of total media environment where there's kind of an overlaying of the virtual and the physical. But the thing that really bridges us from there to here, for context, this is an excerpt from a concert that happened in January of this year. An album just came out in April. So prior to COVID, actually, I had a tour of Europe planned. I was going to be playing in Paris and Berlin and Brussels, etc. But as we all know, there won't be concerts for quite some time. So what ended up happening as COVID started kind of rolling in is we started seeing a lot of musicians, a lot of artists doing concerts online, whether it was through Twitch or Zoom or what have you. And kind of connecting the dots, going back to that Marshall McLuhan idea of saying like, well, all right, if we have a new medium, what can we do that's truly new about it, rather than how can we just use this to make a simulacra or a simulation of something that already exists? Someone tipped me off to Hubs and said, hey, you know what? This already has spatial audio. You can have 3D environments. It's easy to use. You can, you have an equitable access. You don't need a VR headset. So what I ended up doing in, I guess, early March was I wrote a Medium article, just kind of thinking out loud and saying, hey, you know what? We're going to start a virtual DIY venue. And, I have a history of playing kind of virtual, kind of scrappy DIY venues in Brooklyn and New York City. So a lot of things kind of came together where we just started thinking, hey, could this be an opportunity to raise money for artists who need performance opportunities? But also, B, can we use this to explore these new possibilities? And C, can this kind of be a laboratory to really start exploring what a new internet might look like, what these new contexts might look like, and do it all in a very equitable way? So what we've done since then, we created a space, and we started brainstorming, we started Discord, we started having virtual meetings where we'd meet in the space, and started thinking about like, all right, well, what's unique? What's unique to these spaces? And already, just off the top of my head, we have spatial sound and amsonics. There's opportunity for choreography for avatars, soundwalk installations. We're working with some programmers, cooking up some custom A-frame code to build virtual instruments, kind of in the spirit of Jaron Lanier or similar, kind of sound sculptures, virtual installation, etc., etc. And since we've made the space, we've hosted, I think, about 7 concerts with a lot more booked. And some that have really stood out. This is a still shot from Louisa Murr. She's a performer based out of New York City. She did this beautiful performance where she actually live streamed the view out her window. So you could actually hear the birds from Brooklyn streaming into the virtual space. And she played her theremin against it. So we sort of just heard all of this spilling into the space. And it was remarkable. This was actually the second show we did. Just how present it felt, just how much the choreography of a space, sort of the social engagement, just how rich it was. We also, our friend Ali Araska Isaac, she has a Oculus Quest. So she did a night of Mozart arias. And because she was in a VR headset and had the hands, she actually sang the whole aria with the expressive hand gestures. And we were able to really kind of get into this expressivity, this kind of disembodied embodiment. Also, we've collaborated with a lot of artists. This is a space designed by Martina Menegan, our friend from Vienna. We did a concert of her partner, Alexander Martins, who did a live electronics show. And we're still working towards these things. But what's exciting to us is that this kind of moment, not only does it offer sort of a functional answer to these kind of virtual shows, but it connects backwards with a lot of historical precedents with experimental media art and forwards into a lot of new possibilities. One that comes to mind, I imagine some of you are familiar with the composer Pauline Oliveros, who also worked with Morin Subotnick, started the San Francisco Tate Music Center. But when she taught at Mills, she actually used to teach her classes in Second Life and compose. She would have her students compose works for Avatar. So we see ourselves as a continuation of that tradition. But the other thing, and this is maybe kind of the wind up of this talk, maybe before we can do a little bit of talk back and I'd love to take you all actually to the hoop space and show you a sound installation in progress. But if I may, I apologize, but I'm gonna hop on the soapbox for one quick minute. And the cause for that is this question of equitability around emerging virtual reality, especially because the COVID lockdown has accelerated sort of a mainstream interest in this. I think there's a very urgent question of who will conceptualize this future, who is going to build it at scale, and who has agency in this space. And what I mean by this is, will this be a future that's built bottom up by creatives, by community, by folks that have equitable access? Or will it be a top-down new product, a new algorithmic dystopian Facebook, a new Blade Runner hellscape? And actually, just this morning, an article came out in Forbes called "The Metaverse is Coming, and it's a very big deal." And it's very well written, it's very well researched. So I don't begrudge the author necessarily. But with that being said, I think this might be the most depressing article I've ever read. Where most of it is imagining, the first line is, imagine you're walking down the street with your husband and there's a product you wanted to buy, but you forgot the product. You're in luck. A virtual vending machine will appear and you can now buy the product. It then links to this Adobe kind of vision for an AR, VR future. And it's terrifying. It's about 2 minutes, and in the video, this woman, she wakes up. The first thing she does is put on her AR glasses, is immediately bombarded with various pop-ups that allow her to buy things or toggle things or subscribe to things, and goes throughout her day, ending with her buying a house. And what's strange is, if anyone's ever seen the Keiichi Matsuda piece, Hyper Reality, from 2016, which is essentially a satire, a Black Mirror-esque satire of this, it almost seems as if the Adobe folks in the Forbes article took this and, rather than viewing this as a warning sign, actually said, hey, what a great future, let's build that. So, absolutely. Oh my God. Yeah, if anyone wants to build an AR ad block, I think that's a great one. I think there was a Futurama scene about that. But even other than these AR, VR things, I think what's very exciting about hubs, and this idea of a metaverse, I find myself very hesitant to use the term metaverse because I feel it has a lot of connotations to it, that tend to be a lot of tech bro, kind of like sci-fi, hey, what if we just build the, forget the corporation for Blade Runner, but, I think there's another bottom-up way that we can approach this, and I think festivals like Flotilla actually give me a lot of hope for this. I think there's a connection between sort of spaces like this, like Trinity Square Video, like the BAMP Center. Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I think Adobe wants to be Tyrell Corp. So I think the exciting thing is, rather than this top-down kind of hellscape that we found ourselves in, I think if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves there again. There's a lot of models we have. Exactly. I think there's a lot of spectacle selling a very sinister infrastructure. And I think the way a lot of these corporations view the arts is they see it as just a surface. They see it as a fetishized spectacle surface, a veneer that they'll put over a very disturbing infrastructure. And I think what's exciting about the arts is the arts don't just design surfaces, they don't just design aesthetics, but they design structures. And coming out of a history of playing it like DIY basements and venues and places, and where artists do a lot with sticks and twine and no budget, these ways, the connection between experimental arts and direct action, even in the age of COVID, in the way of building community structures, in a way of kind of conceptualizing futures, I see a lot of resonance. So one of the things with hoops for me has been that we can actually start reconceptualizing the way we relate to community structures, to agency in space, to equity. And I think one of the ways we can do this as artists is take a lot of the skills we already know as organizers, and getting away from social networks, we can go back to this early 90s vision of virtual reality and the internet as a space for virtual communities. And I think with beginning kind of decentralized internet, we can get away from being married and anchored to AWS or corporate hosting, but we can actually use the experimental arts both as a way of creating new, beautiful possibilities, but also making these kind of scalable, ship-in-a-bottle models for a more equitable, scalable future. And I think that's hugely exciting. And I think maybe the last one, just as a little kind of live, life, love inspirational quote for the experimental art set, is Buckminster Fuller saying, you don't change things by fighting the reality, you change something by building a model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I think what we're doing with webVR, with hubs, with hoops, with flotilla, with all of this is we can really bundle a lot of these together in ways where we're not just critiquing things, but we're offering a critical path to build something new. I think that's hugely exciting. So, shit, man. Thank you all so much for coming out and hanging out. I think, I'd love to hear from you, kind of answer any questions. Maybe we'd have a little bit of a talk. And then, if we want, if everyone's still feeling it, we can actually hop over to hoops.net and I can show you the space and sound installation there. But, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was beautiful and inspiring for real.
Yeah, thank you.